Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the VAXEE Outset AX. Now the Outset AX that I talked about in my full review is a very impressive mouse, being a VAXEE product with fantastic build quality and overall performance. However, in typical VAXEE fashion, the fantastic build quality of this mouse does come at the cost of a very complex internal design that is not unserviceable, but it is rather tricky to actually work on, as it's very easy to damage many of the components on the inside of the mouse. And while this mouse's disassembly process is very similar to that of the MP01 and 01S, I still wanted to make a full in-depth teardown guide to show you guys how to safely disassemble and reassemble this mouse if you have to repair it. Now, as a quick preface to this video, all VAXEE products I've talked about here on the channel, and including this one, are mice I would not recommend servicing yourself unless you've exhausted all your support options. So if you have a VAXEE product and there is something wrong with it and it's under warranty, send it to VAXEE for repair, as again, servicing this unit is a little difficult and it's very easy to damage some of the internal components. So only service the mouse yourself if you've exhausted all your other support options, as again, it can be a little tricky to work on. Now, if you do end up servicing the mouse yourself, you will need a couple additional tools as to what we normally use to take apart mice. Firstly, having an electronics repair screwdriver kit is going to be very beneficial, as a lot of the screws inside the mouse are quite small, and also on the base of the mouse, in typical VAXEE style, it is using Torx screws, and you will need a specific bit to get these off. So having a screwdriver set with Torx bits as well as the various sizes of Phillips heads bits will be very beneficial, as you will need them to open the mouse. Next, you're also going to need a pencil or some kind of dull object you can use to push some components out of the mouse, and you're also going to need some tape. Now, I'm just using Scotch tape, but you can use pretty much whatever you want, but due to all the ribbon cables inside the mouse, having some tape on hand to tape things down and also keep some things in place when we reassemble the mouse is going to be very helpful, so I'd highly recommend having these tools as well. And lastly, having something like a soldering mat or something to keep your mouse in place as you take it apart, and also something to keep track of all the components and screws. That's why I use a soldering mat, as it has all that built in, but you can use pretty much whatever you want. Just make sure you have some way to track all the mouse's components and screws, as there are a lot inside this mouse and you don't want to mix any of them up. But once you've gone ahead and assembled all your tools, you are ready to go ahead and tear down the VAXEE Outset AX. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, now to disassemble the top and base shells, first thing we're going to do is we're going to flip the mouse over and we're going to go ahead and grab our Torx bit here, and we're going to undo a screw here and a screw here. Once those screws are removed, you can take your fingers and put them into a little bit of a pincer like this and put a little bit of pressure on the back of the shell, and you see how it will crease open just like that. And then you can take a fingernail or a pry tool and run it along the side of the shell to disconnect the shells on the base here. Now once that's done, as we've seen on VAXEE's previous mice, the base shell here is kind of anchored into the top shell with these little prongs towards the top here. So what you need to do is pull the shell back out at an angle like this and gently pull down to disconnect it. Now once it's apart, do not rip the shells apart, as you can see there is a bunch of internal components here, and this is one of the biggest pitfalls of servicing VAXEE's mice, as people just rip the shells apart and don't think there's anything attached when there's actually a lot of things attached. So once you get the shells open, you'll need to reach in and gently disconnect a lot of these, which can be a little finicky, but once you get your fingers in there, it shouldn't be too bad. So we'll disconnect this one towards the back, this one here, and then lastly, we'll disconnect the batteries connector here, which due to its thicker nature can be a little harder, but once you get it disconnected, it should come out in one piece. Now that we've got the shells disconnected, we're gonna go ahead and put the base off to the side for now, and let's focus on disassembling the top shell next. Alright, now the top shell disassembly is probably going to be the most complicated part of this process aside from reassembling it, as there are a lot of internal components we need to worry about here. Now first off, what I'd recommend doing is kind of moving some of these cables out of the way. You can tape them down to the top of the shell if you'd like to, just be very careful not to damage them. So you're going to kind of have to hold all these cables out of the way like this as you take everything apart, which can be a little finicky, and again, if you need to, you can tape these down. And first thing what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove this screw right here. And then once that's removed, we're also going to remove a screw from here and a screw from here. And then once those are removed, in order to remove this central cage-like structure, we actually have to undo two screws that are under the main clicks, meaning we're going to have to go ahead and take out the main clicks next. So hold all these pieces off to the side again, and go ahead and remove a screw from here, 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 and here. Just be mindful with this one here because it is very close to the battery, so make sure you don't puncture the battery with your screwdriver bit. So just kind of go in at an angle and remove it like this. Now, unlike VAXEE's previous mice where there was a little more wiggle room for these main clicks in the top shell, there's actually a very low amount of clearance here, so it's a little harder to get these out. We have to do a rather unique method of removing them, so bear with me here. So what you need to do is flip the mouse over, and you want to press down at the top of the clicks here, and you want to kind of push them into the shell, kind of like that. What this does is it slightly raises the clicks off of their standoffs just a little bit, and then what you can do is you can take a flathead screwdriver or a plastic pry tool, put it kind of in that little seam there and pull up, which will dislodge the click. Now, generally speaking, I don't recommend doing things like this, but because the plastic on these clicks is so strong, the chance of you damaging them is very unlikely, and as long as you push them into the shell to remove them, you should be able to get them up pretty easily. So we're going to do the same process on this side. Screwdriver in through the bottom, press up to disconnect the click, and then you can pull it out of the shell just like that. And then with the clicks removed, we can flip the mouse over, and now we have access to those screws I mentioned earlier, and now we can safely remove a screw from here and a screw from here. Alright, now with those screws removed, next we have to go ahead and remove this central cage-like structure from the entire shell, which is a little bit finicky, so bear with me for this part as well. Now, the easiest way I've found to do this is to take your thumbs and put a little bit of pressure on this black piece here, maybe towards the front a little more, and you want to kind of pop the standoffs off the front here. As you can see, they're kind of separated from their little standoffs to the front. And then you want to flip the shell over, reach into this back shell thing, and just pull up. Now, it may take a little bit of pressure to get this off, but if you've done this correctly, it should just pop out of the shell in one solid piece just like this. Now I'm going to put the cage structure off to the side for a minute. We'll talk about the top shell here, because unlike the MP01 and ONS, you can actually remove the side buttons here on the VAXEE Outset AX, which is a great thing to see. And you can do this by just gently pulling up on the side here, as well as the side on the other side here, and the side buttons will just pop out in one solid piece. Now this is a really nice thing because, as I talked about in a full review, these side buttons are solid plastic. They do not have a coating on them, which makes them kind of slippery. So if you want to apply a coating to the side buttons to make them as grippy as the rest of the shell, you can do so here on the Outset AX, where you couldn't really do that on VAXEE's other mice, which is a nice thing to see. And then with the side buttons removed, that is everything for the top shell here, so we'll put this off to the side. Now we can go ahead and talk about this central cage-like structure. Now the first thing we can remove here is this top PCB here, which we can do so by just grabbing this and kind of pushing it forward to knock it out of its slot. Now there was a piece of tape over this, and I'll talk about why that is later in this video, but this little PCB is just the indicator LEDs that correspond to the little lights on the top of the shell here. But this PCB is actually a bit of a pain in the ass, as it likes to come loose out of its little connector quite frequently during the reinstallation process, hence why I tape it down, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. Next up on the cage-like structure, we have the side button PCB here, which we can actually remove quite easily, as you can take a screwdriver and put it under this ribbon cable, gently pull the cable out of the shell, peel this cable back gently and kind of hold it open like this, revealing a little anchoring screw, and then we can remove that. And then with that removed, we can let go of the ribbon cable, and you can grab by the bottom of the switches and just kind of pull this PCB out of its little anchoring point here, just like that, and the PCB will come off in one solid piece just like this. Next up, we have the main click PCB, which has the scroll wheel encoder, scroll wheel click, and the two main clicks here, which is also held in by 4 anchoring screws that are positioned here, 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 and here, and we can remove those. To disconnect the PCB, and we can pick it up by the scroll wheel here and just pull it out of the shell just like this, and the whole main click PCB and scroll wheel PCB will come off in one solid piece. And we can also take out the scroll wheel by just gently pulling this wheel out of the encoder just like this, as an angle, removing the scroll wheel. Now next up we have the battery. Now as I mentioned earlier, on traditional VAXEE products, when ones that haven't been opened before, there will be a piece of black adhesive over the battery here, which will hold it in place. Now if you do need to remove the battery, you will need to do a little bit of a unique thing, as you have to remove this adhesive, and then you have to take a dull kind of object like the back of a pencil, push up on the bottom area right here to gently disconnect the battery from its little adhesive pad, which is sitting right there. Now, due to the battery's unique size and capacity, I would not recommend modding the mouse's battery, as again, a lot of the weight components of this mouse are due to the cage-like structure in the top shell. So modding this battery out for a smaller one doesn't really make a lot of sense, so I would not remove the battery from the cage-like structure unless you're replacing the battery, in which you'll have to. But any other case, I would recommend leaving the battery in place, as again, it is kind of anchored in very uniquely, and it is kind of difficult to remove, so I would leave it in place unless you absolutely have to take it out. But that's everything for the top shell here, so let's put this off to the side for a moment, and now let's go ahead and talk about the base shell next. Alright, now the base shell here on the Outset AX is very similar to the base shells we've seen in the MP01 and ONS, having pretty much the exact same design with this large PCB here, which is held in by 4 anchoring screws here, 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 and here, which once removed, allows us to take the PCB out. However, it's important to note that at the front of the shell there is a small little plastic lip that kind of holds this PCB in place. So what you have to do is you have to get your finger under the PCB, kind of angle it upwards, and then pull it back in out just like that to remove the PCB as a whole piece. Now these base controls here are also removable, as if you flip the shell over they'll probably fall out. Now again, you don't need to remove these, but I'm going to remove them for the sake of thoroughness here. We can also take out the slider button on the base here, which fell out of the shell, and we can even remove these bottom control buttons here as well, which is quite handy, and you can remove those by just taking this piece off. But with that removed, that is everything for the base shell here. We'll put that off to the side for now. And now let's go ahead and grab all of our PCBs again and our other components and talk a little bit more about the mouse's specs and the actual layout of their PCBs. Alright, starting off, let's talk about the battery, which, as I talked about earlier, is a 400 milliamp 3.7 volt battery, which uses a 2mm 3-pin JST connector, which is the larger size we don't commonly see. Most mice use 1mm or 1.5mm connectors, but VAXEE is using the larger connector. So if you need to get a new battery, make sure it is the proper voltage and also uses this larger 2mm JST connector. Next, we have this top lighting indicator PCB that I talked about earlier that just controls the lighting on the top shell, so it's not super important. And then we also have the side button PCB here, which is a very small PCB that uses the 1.0 black shell white dot micro switches that I've talked about in my full review, which feel pretty well implemented. And as a big benefit, all of the PCBs on this mouse, including the top LED indicator, actually use double-sided ribbon cables, which, while not like super uncommon, is a nice thing to see from a repairability standpoint, as if your PCB fails, you can either just replace the PCB itself or the cable if the cable gets damaged. So VAXEE using these ribbon cables that are replaceable on both sides makes repairing this mouse, even though it is a little complicated to get the mouse open, pretty easy, which is great to see. And then we also have the main click PCB here, which is also its own separate module here, which has the ALP 7mm 24-step mechanical encoder, the same 1.0 black shell white dot micro switch we saw used for the side buttons, and the 1.0 black shell pink dot switches used for the main clicks, which is the expected switch we've seen VAXEE use on almost all of their mice, at least the ones I've covered here on the channel, which are pretty well implemented, though they do have a lower cycle rating. And lastly, we have the main PCB here, which is a much larger PCB that we see on most mice nowadays due to the mouse's age. I assume VAXEE's newer mice are going to be a little more weight optimized in terms of its PCB, but given the Outset AX's age, this is to be expected. And on the PCB, we have the Pixar 3395 sensor here, and then we have the Pixar MCU, which again, while not being a Nordic MCU, does actually perform very well due to VAXEE's collaboration with Pixar for the sensor and the MCU. So despite the unique choice here, the mouse still does have fantastic performance. Alright, now that we've talked all about the mouse's specs, let's go ahead and talk about the mouse's individual component weights next. Alright, now in terms of component weights here for the Outset AX, starting off with the top shell, which has everything in it, including this little rubber adapter here, but the side button's removed. It weighs around 16.5 grams. The side buttons weigh around 0.9 grams. The central cage-like structure with everything removed from it weighs 7.7 grams. The mouse's 400 mAh battery weighs 8.2 grams. The top shell's light PCB with its ribbon cable weighs collectively 0.5 grams. The side button PCB with its ribbon cable weighs around 0.8 grams. The main click PCB with its ribbon cable weighs 3.6 grams. The mouse's scroll wheel weighs 2.6 grams. Each shell button weighs around 3.3 grams. And collectively they weigh around 6.8 grams. The base shell with everything removed from it weighs around 9.8 grams. The base control buttons, power slider, and light threaders collectively weigh around 1.1 grams. The mouse's main board with everything removed from it weighs around 9.2 grams. And lastly, all the screws inside the Outset AX weigh around 2.2 grams, bringing the mouse's collective total weight to around the 71 gram range. And the mouse is advertised as weighing around 73 grams with the stock skates, and seeing as the stock skates weigh around 1.9 grams or so, the mouse's overall weight with all these components plus the stock skates will be around the 73 gram range as advertised. Alright, now we've talked all about the mouse's specs and component weights, let's go ahead and start our reassembly process, and we're going to start off with the top shell, specifically the central cage-like structure here. Now to start off, we're going to go ahead and grab our main click PCB here, and we're also going to grab our scroll wheel, and you're going to look at the scroll wheel and find the thinner textured end here, and you want to put that into this hole in the encoder, so just gently line it up and press it in, just like that. However, though, you want to make sure you don't push it all the way, and you want to give it a little bit of leeway here, kind of like that, as the actual tolerance for the scroll wheel in the top shell is quite thin. You need to make sure this is positioned correctly, so just make sure to give it a little bit of room, just like that. Once the scroll wheel is installed, go back to the central cage, take the ribbon cable here and feed it through this hole towards the back, and then you want to put the PCB in and over just like this. Now, unlike the MP01 and 01S, there is no clip towards the back here to hold this PCB in place. The PCB just kind of rests here, so you don't need to worry about that, but you want to make sure that these plastic standoffs sit even with the surface of the PCB like they do towards the back here. The front ones are a little finicky because they need to be anchored down, but you just want to make sure they look kind of like this. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and grab your anchoring screws and you can re-anchor the PCB down. And then once those are anchored in, make sure that the scroll wheel is still scrolling properly. If your scroll wheel feels a little tense, just go ahead and pull it out from the encoder just a little bit, because as I mentioned earlier, there is a very slight tolerance there. So just make sure the wheel is sitting roughly even of that, and again, make sure it's scrolling freely. Now, once that's done, that is everything for the main click PCB here. We can go on to the side button PCB, which is also quite easy to install. As all we do is take the side button PCB and put it into that little slot right there. So just slot it into place, just like that. And then you want to hold the PCB in place while also bending this ribbon cable over like that. And then you can go ahead and re-anchor the anchoring screw. And then once that's done, make sure the PCB isn't moving at all. And then you can take the ribbon cable and feed it through the top of the shell, out through the bottom, just like that. Next up, we're going to go ahead and re-anchor our battery. Now again, I do not advise removing this unless you're replacing the battery, but if you do remove it, you can go ahead and slot it back into its little holder like this, and you want the cable to be coming out of this side. And then once it's back in place, go ahead and take a piece of tape, put it over this end here and loop it around the back, just like that, just to make sure the battery stays in place. Now, the adhesive pad on the bottom of the battery is actually quite good, so the chance of the battery coming loose is very rare, but having this extra piece of tape here just to safeguard it isn't the worst idea. And again, I do not recommend removing this unless you absolutely have to. And then lastly, we have this top LED PCB. Now, you can slot this into the top shell by putting it towards the top and dragging it into place just like that. But as you can see, it comes loose very easily. And if this is loose, you cannot put this cage-like structure back in the top shell. So because of this, what I recommend doing is taking a small piece of tape and just taping over the PCB just to kind of hold it in place. Now, sometimes you can get lucky and the PCB will actually hold in place as you put the mouse together, but from my experience, it's much easier to tape it in place because it comes loose very easily. And then with this anchored down, that is everything for the cage-like structure here, so we'll put that off to the side. Now we're going to go ahead and grab our top shell here, and we're going to reinstall our side buttons, which we can do by taking the side buttons, putting them into place like this, and just pressing them down into their little connectors. And you can verify they're in place properly by flipping the mouse over and making sure these buttons actually sink into the shell, just like that. Now comes the very fun part where we have to take this whole cage-like structure and put it back into this top shell. Now this is a little tricky to show, so I'm going to do my best to show you guys how to properly do this. But basically, you have to take this PCB and put it into the top shell like this, angle it down in a way where the scroll wheel matches its little connector here, while also clipping the shell into the top connector here, while also making sure these stabilizers line up. Now this is one other tricky aspect to the scroll wheel here, as you can see when we tried to do this, the scroll wheel is interfering with us quite a bit here, and that is because it's most likely too close here. So give the scroll wheel another little tug just to pull it out a little more to give us a little more leeway here, and let's try this again. We'll put this in through the bottom like this. And if we're lucky, it should make proper contact, and see how it slot in like that. And then what you want to do is you want to go to the front region and push down on these connectors here to anchor this into place. And then you want to flip the shell over, press on the bottom, and you'll hear a couple clips, which means it fell into place properly. Now, before you screw anything in, verify your scroll wheel works, as again, there is very little tolerance for the scroll wheel, and if it's too far to the left or right, it won't work properly. So make sure your scroll wheel works and make sure your scroll wheel click is still functioning, as that is a very important aspect to the most. You want to make sure that is fully functional. Once you've verified all that is working, we're going to go ahead and flip the shell over to the base again, and we're going to pull all these ribbon cables out of the way, and you're going to reinstall that central anchoring screw that we removed earlier. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip the shell over, and we're going to reinstall the anchoring screws that go towards the front of the shell here and here. And then we're going to flip the mouse over, and we're going to reinstall the two anchoring screws that go here and here. All right, and then once the cage structure has been anchored into the shell, this is where this gets very interesting, as now we have to reinstall the shell buttons. Now at this point, I'd recommend grabbing some Scotch tape if you haven't already, and taping down some of these cables just to keep them out of the way as you do this part. Specifically the side button cable here, as it runs right where the click is going to go, and it's actually quite easy to damage this if you're not careful, so make sure to tape this out of the way. So if we're going to start off with this one here, what you want to do is you want to kind of slot it into the top part of the shell here, but you need to kind of angle it in a little bit to get it into place. And then you can flip this over, and then once you get it roughly into place, you want to press down on the connectors here on the inside to anchor it onto its standoffs. Then flip the mouse over and make sure it's actually sitting in. Sometimes it won't go down all the way, it will kind of sit over its anchoring mechanism, so you have to press it into place like that. Make sure it's sitting completely flat, and then you want to re-anchor the clicks. But as always, when it comes to these screws, you have to be very careful not to over tension them, as doing so can break your clicks. So make sure you screw these in until you feel a little bit of feedback. All right, and then once that's done, just verify your click works. Just like that, it should have a natural buoyancy to it, as we see here, which means it is successfully installed. Now we're going to take the other click and do the exact same process on the other side of the shell. So we're going to fit it in through the top here, kind of at an angle to get it into place. You kind of have to twist this one a little bit for some reason. And then once you kind of get it into place, you're going to reach in and press it into place. Just like that. Make sure the click is resting into its stabilizer, which it is towards the top. And then we're going to go ahead and re-anchor these central anchoring screws. And just like I said for the other one, just make sure you screw these in until you feel a little bit of feedback. Do not over tension them. All right, and then once those are clicked into place, verify our click is working, which it is, and then we can go ahead and remove this tape we used to secure down these cables. Gently, of course, make sure you don't damage the ribbon cables as you do this. And just verify everything is working again. Make sure your scroll wheel functions, make sure your click works, and make sure your side buttons still work as well. Now let's go ahead and put this off to the side for now, and now let's go ahead and reassemble the base shell. Alright, now for the base shell, thankfully for us, this is much easier to work on than the top shell was. This is going to be a pretty straightforward process. However, we do have to go through the process of reinstalling all of these buttons. Now, the first ones are pretty straightforward here, as these are the bottom control buttons, and they actually rest on top of these little prongs here. So all you do is just line it up on top as best as you can, and they will naturally settle into place just like that. Next up, we have the little control LEDs on the bottom here, which rest here, and the red one always goes to the farthest right, as it has for all of VAXEE's previous mice. And then lastly, we have the slider here for the power, which you want to orient into the shell like this, with this little ledge sitting towards the outside of the shell, and that rests right there. Now, one very important note here, you want to make sure this is in the bottommost orientation, and you want to take a look at your PCB and make sure that this slider switch is also in its bottommost orientation. If this is in the on position and you try and shove it into this connector, you could break this switch, rendering your mouse inoperable. So make sure that this is in the off position, and make sure the button is also all the way down, just like that. Now, once that's done, we can take the PCB and re-anchor it into the base shell here, but remember there is that small little clip towards the front here, so you have to angle the PCB in like this, and then just gently drop it into place. Now, you might have to fiddle with it a little bit to get it onto its standoffs, but with a little bit of fidgeting, you should be able to get it into place just like that. Now, before you screw anything in, put your finger on the top, flip the mouse over, and make sure that this power slider still functions as it should, just like that, to work good there. Now, once you verify that's functional, flip the mouse back over and verify the PCB is still sitting in place, and then you can go ahead and take your anchoring screws and re-anchor the PCB onto the base shell. Alright, then once all those anchoring screws are reinstalled, go ahead and flip the mouse over and just retest your buttons to make sure nothing came loose during the installation process, which everything is working here. And with that, that is everything for the base shell. A much easier reassembly process than the top shell we just did, but now we have the fun task of reassembling the top shell to the base shell. Alright, now this process is going to be really hard for me to show because I have such big hands, and this is very much a tiny hands repair, but regardless, I'll do my best to show you guys how to do this. Now, basically, all we have to do is reinstall all these various cables into the shell. However, it's very important to know you have to orient these cables in a specific way, so you want to make sure that this cable towards the back is resting like this. You want to have this ribbon cable for the side button under this, the battery ribbon cable over that, and then on top of all of that, the central ribbon cable here for the main click PCB. If you have it oriented other ways these cables could press against each other, possibly disconnecting them or interfering with the shells going back together. So make sure you orient your cables something like this. And then once everything is ready to go ahead and grab your shells, and you want to start connecting these. Now I would recommend starting with this back one because it is the trickiest, as it has to go into that very tiny connector on the back there. So just take your time, anchor it into place. So connect it in like that. Sorry, it's really hard to show. And then take this central ribbon cable and then connect it into here like that. And then you can go ahead and take your battery connector, plug that into there just like that. And then lastly, reach your side button cable around like that and kind of anchor it into place as best as you can. Just again, be careful with the cable, make sure you don't damage it. Now, once you've gotten all these cables into place, what I recommend doing is taking the mouse, turning it on, and verify everything still functions. So verify your side buttons work, verify your main clicks work, verify your scroll wheel works, and verify the sensor and all of its buttons work as well. If something doesn't work, most likely there's something wrong with the cable's connection, so reseat the cable and reconnect it. There's a very low chance something's wrong with the upper components because as long as the button physically moves, it should work, and the common issue area is these cables. So if you have an issue, just make sure to disconnect and reconnect the cable and it should fix your issue. And then once you've verified everything is functional, turn your mouse back off, take the shells, and remember these little prongs towards the top we talked about? You want to angle them into the top of the shell at an angle just like that to push it into place, and then push down towards the back to kind of hold the shells together like that. And then you can go ahead, grab your Torx bit we used earlier, and then re-anchor the base screws. And once you've done that, you've successfully disassembled and reassembled the VAXEE Outset AX wireless. Overall, as we've seen with VAXEE's previous mice, serviceability is a bit of a mixed bag as it is a very difficult to service unit in many aspects. But if you know what you're doing, you can service the mouse pretty easily, and a lot of the components inside the mice are actually pretty modular, which is great to see. And again, the ribbon cables are double-sided, so if you do damage a ribbon cable, it's very easy to replace them. So while the mouse has great long-term serviceability from a mechanical point of view, actually getting to a lot of the components is very tricky, which is why, again, I do not recommend servicing any of VAXEE's mice yourself unless you've exhausted all of your support options, as it's very easy to damage a lot of the components on the inside of the mouse. But with that, that's going to be everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thank you very much for watching. If you did miss my full review of the VAXEE Outset AX, you can go check that out on my channel. I did a full in-depth dive of this mouse's pros and cons, how it performs in 2025, and what VAXEE could do if they ever gave this mouse a V2 treatment, which I really hope they do. And if there is a V2 of the Outset AX in the future, I will definitely be reviewing it, and I will of course make a teardown video for that mouse as well. Now, if you enjoyed the video and want to see more teardown videos like this, in-depth reviews or guide videos, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you'd like to support my efforts here with the Teardown project specifically, become a channel member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and members make these videos possible, and all channel members get early access to all upcoming content here on the channel. But that's everything for today's video covering the VAXEE Outset AX. Thank you very much again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of Teardown. Peace.